through the flesh of the earth.
In the morning, everything around seemed strangely motionless. Even the ash had stopped falling, as if the air held its breath. I emerged from my shelter, and the water in the containers I had left for cleaning with the filter remained clear. But the bitterness of metal was palpable even through the mask. With each passing day, the earth beneath my feet became increasingly loose. Perhaps the acid rains had done their work, or maybe something else, less obvious, was at play. It felt as though this whole world was losing its solidity, unraveling like fabric subjected to fire. Along the old road, I noticed another thing. The cracked asphalt revealed something like sinkholes, huge voids leading downwards. It was as if the earth could no longer bear the weight of the past, swallowing everything that remained on the surface. I considered exploring one of these places, but common sense held me back. If the soil was unstable, any step could be my last. However, the thought that something else might be hidden beneath this gray, silent crust wouldn't let me rest. That morning, I set out towards the road that led to the old bridge. Even before the impacts, trucks frequently passed here, leaving deep ruts in the soil. Now, this road was completely covered with a layer of ash. I walked along it, reflecting on how everything had changed when I noticed something strange. The ground beneath my feet was loose, and the surface of the earth had cracked. This wasn't just dried soil. The cracks went deeper, and in some places, narrow chasms leading down could be seen between them. At first, I thought this was a result of the recent acid rain, but the longer I looked, the more I understood. It was something else. The earth seemed to be losing its strength, as if something within it was causing it to crumble. All night, I dreamed of the chasms. They beckoned me back. Their dark depths called out like a voice from the past. I knew I couldn't ignore them.
The last light.
The next morning, I returned to that place. I stood at the edge of one of the chasms and looked down. The light that I directed there did not reach the bottom. Only the uneven walls, covered in a gray coating, descended into the depths. What is down there beneath me? This question seemed to settle in my mind, filling the void of loneliness. I imagined the earth absorbing the remnants of the past, old cities, roads, cars. Perhaps all of this no longer existed above the surface. Everything that remained had sunk here, into these bottomless chasms. The road I walked on was becoming increasingly damaged. Cracks were everywhere, and in some places, the asphalt had collapsed, exposing the innards of the earth. In one spot, I noticed the remnants of a concrete structure, perhaps an old foundation. The daylight, dim and gray, highlighted every detail. The walls of the chasm seemed smooth, as if shaped by water or wind. The air in these places was different, heavy, infused with the scent of bitterness. I returned to my shelter to prepare for exploration. I needed to understand what lay beneath me.
The depth.
The next day, I decided to approach these chasms more closely. I circled around them, trying to understand how far they extended. It turned out that the cracks ran along the old road, as if following some invisible route. They grew wider, and their edges looked as though they had been torn apart from within. I leaned down to peer inside. The light I directed there only briefly revealed fragments of stones and sand covered with a film of something black. Then the beam lost itself in absolute darkness. The walls inside seemed damp, and the air wafting from the chasm was tinged with a metallic taste. I returned to the largest chasm I had noticed earlier. The decision to descend inside had been brewing within me all morning. Taking a flashlight, some ropes, and a hook, I approached the edge. It seemed even the wind paused here, not daring to enter this place. The first few meters down were the most challenging. The soil crumbled and the stones treacherously slipped beneath my feet. When I was halfway down, the air became denser. It was cold, and each wave of wind rising from below brought with it the smell of smoke and something even more unfamiliar. The bottom of the chasm turned out to be unexpectedly flat. The beam of my flashlight picked out from the darkness walls covered in thin black veins. These lines pulsed with a faint light, reminiscent of fossilized roots that had awakened from a long sleep. I slowly ran my hand along one of the veins. It felt warm, as if a liquid moved within it. It was hard to believe I was underground, in a place that seemed never to have seen light. On the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more down there, something I couldn't see, but that now permeated each of my breaths. The sinkholes, cracks, damp walls, all seemed part of something alive, something that breathed beneath the earth. What if this isn't destruction? What if this is the beginning of something new? This thought lingered with me throughout the day. Perhaps these cracks are the Earth's way of freeing itself from the past. What is this? Remnants of a technology I don't understand. A part of the Earth itself, ripped away in a moment of catastrophe? Or something greater, something that was never meant to be found? My thoughts were tangled. I tried to write them down in my notebook, but each time I erased what I had written. There were no answers, only growing questions. I decided to return there, this time not just to look, but to understand. Perhaps this was the key to everything that had happened.
The return.
The next day, I set out back to the chasm. Now I was better prepared. I took tools I could find in abandoned houses, extra batteries for the flashlight, and a backpack for any findings. As I approached the chasm, I thought about how these cracks were merely a consequence of something large that had happened to the Earth. Perhaps the nuclear strikes had not only destroyed cities, but had also altered the very structure of the planet. I felt a tremor beneath my feet again, faint and barely noticeable. It wasn't an earthquake in the usual sense. Rather, it was a slow, almost imperceptible movement, as if the earth beneath me was still living its life. When I descended into the chasm, the air was cold and damp. The light of the flashlight revealed smooth walls from which moisture dripped. At the bottom of the chasm were strange sedimentary formations, gray, almost glassy structures resembling salt crystals. They seemed to have absorbed the remnants of the chemicals that had poisoned this land. I discovered that a narrow tunnel extended from the chasm, sloping downwards. This passage did not look natural. Its walls were carved, as if they had been hollowed out by a powerful flow of water or gas. The light of the flashlight pierced through the thick humidity that filled the tunnel. Drops of water dripped from the ceiling, and the walls bore traces resembling remnants of something organic. I recalled my old books about mines and karst caves. The tunnel looked exactly as described by geologists studying natural formations.
Deeper.
I decided to continue. The tunnel was getting wider, and its walls were covered with a layer of dust mixed with sediment. After a few dozen meters, I saw signs of old engineering structures, rusted pipes, partially collapsed supports. People were here, I thought. Perhaps this was part of an old mine or an underground bunker, hidden deep beneath the earth. These tunnels might have been used for resource extraction or, more likely, as shelter during airstrikes. Deeper into the tunnel, I came across what remained of the equipment. Corroded metal beams, half-destroyed boxes filled with what once were tools. Much had been destroyed by time and dampness, but a few objects remained. Among other things, I found an old generator. Its casing was covered in rust and the wires looked like frozen icicles. I tried to open the lid, but the metal was too brittle and cracked under my fingers. The passage was becoming more difficult. The ground beneath my feet started to sink, and the tunnel walls were closing in. The air was getting thicker, saturated with the smell of dampness and something that resembled a mixture of metal and mold. I stopped to catch my breath. It was then that I heard a hum, faint, almost imperceptible. It came from deep inside. It wasn't the sound of machines, but something deeper, more like the movement of the earth.
Collapse.
The next day, I continued my journey. The tunnel led me deeper. and the further I went, the more signs of destruction I saw. The supports holding up the ceiling began to crack, and I realized I was in danger. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking my way back. I was trapped in this underground maze, surrounded by silence and dust. Trapped, I decided to move forward. There was no point in going back. I gathered all my strength to make my way through the rubble and destroyed structures. Every step was hard. My supplies of food and water were running low, and I began to ration every drop. The heavy air made it hard for my lungs to work, but I knew that stopping meant death. After several hours of wandering, I entered a large underground chamber. It was vast, with high walls and a ceiling that disappeared into the darkness. In the center of the chamber stood an old tank, resembling a system for storing water or fuel. I inspected the tank. Its walls had signs of corrosion, but inside it seemed something remained. Perhaps this liquid could save me if it was still usable. I decided to leave the chamber and continue my journey. The tunnels were getting wider, and the air was getting fresher. This gave me hope that I was nearing the exit. On the walls, I began to notice symbols, possibly left by the builders of these tunnels. They were simple markers indicating direction. I chose the path leading upward, hoping it would bring me back to the surface.
Closer to the surface.
The tunnel I had chosen became steeper. The air was cooler, and the musty smell was replaced by a faint but noticeable metallic taste. This could be a bad sign, collapsed structures or chemical leaks, but I decided it was my only chance. Every step required effort. The stones underfoot were slippery, and the walls crumbled at the slightest touch. Sometimes I would stop to catch my breath, pressing against the wall and listening for any sounds that might indicate the movement of the earth or a possible collapse. By evening, I came across another sign of past human activity, a metal door half submerged in rubble. Its surface was covered in rust, but the handle still seemed sturdy. I pulled on it, and with a loud creak, the door gave way. Behind it was a small corridor leading into a room resembling a technical chamber. Inside, there were many old pipes covered in dust and corrosion. Electric cables hung from the walls. In the center of the room, I found a control panel. Its buttons were worn down, and the screen was shattered. It seemed this system once powered the network of tunnels. I didn't know how to activate it, but the thought that there might be other ways out gave me a new burst of energy. In this bunker, I found something useful. Several old fuel cans with some remnants inside, a rusty but working crowbar, and a piece of plastic film that could be used to collect moisture. I spent several hours exploring the room. Most of the doors were locked, but one led to a new tunnel going upward. The walls here seemed more stable, and the air was fresher.
Climb.
The tunnel turned out to be long, but its direction clearly pointed upward. I walked, sometimes crawling, squeezing through narrow sections. The air grew lighter, and the dust settled less on my face. A few times I noticed traces of human activity on the walls, marks carved into the stone, remnants of old lanterns, discarded tools. These traces indicated that people had once been here, perhaps miners or builders. I stood at a narrow crack in the ground leading to the outside. The process of expanding the passage was slow and exhausting, but each movement gave me hope. I used the crowbar I had found in the bunker to pry out stones and boulders blocking the exit. The rocks crumbled under the blows, and with each strike I felt the air growing lighter. With every swing of my tool, the crack widened, and after a while I was able to see light. It was faint, dim light, as if the sun could not break through the thick clouds. But to me it was a signal that I was once again on the surface, where something still remained of the old world. The digging continued, and I began to understand that the passage I was trying to escape through was not just some random fracture. It was a path that other people, perhaps, had once tried to use to get out. Here, in these cracks, traces of human activity might still exist, but they were hidden beneath layers of earth and ash. The crack widened, and I saw its edges unfold like the pages of an old book. My efforts were rewarded, and finally, I was able to crawl through the narrow gap, pulling out stones and debris to create a way for myself. The air became fresh, but it was filled with the smell of scorched earth. I didn't immediately realize that I stood in complete silence. There were no animal sounds, no rustling of leaves. Everything was so dead that it seemed even the air had been poisoned. When I finally emerged, it took me a few seconds to adjust to the openness and the light that fell from the sky. I saw before me the same scene I had first experienced when the catastrophe hit. Everything was covered in ash. The cities had disappeared, and the buildings I could still see in the distance stood empty, like dead witnesses to a bygone time. I took a few steps and stopped to look around. Before me spread a landscape that seemed to have lost life forever. Ash covered the earth like a thick layer of fluff, and in the distance the ruins of buildings, burned-out houses, and empty streets could clearly be seen, places where people once walked. The gray sky hung low, not allowing sunlight to penetrate this world, creating the sense that the sky itself had become part of this dead world. However, I knew one thing: I had survived. I was once again on the surface. My journey had been long and difficult, but now, new horizons were opening before me. I was ready to search and explore this dead world. This was not a waste of time. I knew I had to move forward, despite the terrible emptiness around me. I was the one who could still keep searching. I took a step forward, another, and another. Now I was moving not in search of shelter, but in search of an answer. No matter how hard it was, I felt that everything that had happened to this world was not yet finished, and I had to find out what lay beyond.
Leaving a mark.
On the surface, it seemed there was nothing new, only the same cracks and sinkholes, overgrown with ash, as if nature were trying to hide the consequences of the catastrophe. But the further I walked, the more clearly I felt that something bigger was hidden underground. These depressions were not just the result of erosion or soil subsidence. They seemed to be the result of something active, hidden, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow everything that remained. At one point, I noticed a strange network of cracks that led downward, forming tunnel-like passages. It seemed there were hidden structures or even tunnels beneath the surface, ones I could not fully see. They didn't look like natural caves. This was something more artificial. I stood at the edge of one of these cracks, feeling the cold air pulling me into its dark depths. The feeling that I was standing on the brink of something important did not leave me. In these tunnels, the truth of what had happened to the world might be hidden, something that still existed despite everything. But after all these days, I had to return to my basement, my safe place. However, continuing the exploration of this rift became my sole purpose at that moment. I returned to the basement, the place where I had once hidden from everything that remained of the world. It seemed so familiar, yet foreign at the same time. Here, I felt safe, though I knew safety was an illusion. When I descended into my refuge, trying not to leave traces on the dusty floor, I felt my body finally relax. All this time, I had been in constant tension, striving to survive, to cover miles through the ruined world, searching for answers and surviving every moment. Now, as I returned, there was a strange feeling that I had come back to the place where it all started. Only now, everything was different. Time in the basement had stopped. It became not just a physical shelter, but something like a storage place for thoughts and fears. I didn't immediately sit at the table and open my notebook. First, I just sat in the dark corner, listening to the silence that filled the space. The silence was heavy, as if it were squeezing me from all sides. I knew that no one else was in the world anymore. It was only me and the emptiness, and all that remained was to remember, write, and try to understand what had happened. Finally, I picked up the notebook and pen. The silence around me remained uninterrupted. I began to write about everything that had happened.